So it's very nice to be here once again. See all the friends, to see how the ashram is growing and what nice work is being done here. When I spoke to Sushmita about possible topics, and she said, why not speak about the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna? I was very happy. I haven't spoken on that topic here before, and to me the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is equally holy to the Vedas, Vedanta, Upanishad, Gita, everything. And in my personal spiritual life, this has been the most important scripture for me. I think that there's absolutely nothing that we don't get in the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. If we don't have the time or energy or interest to study Upanishads and Gita and Puranas and everything else, all we have to do is read the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and we get everything there. In fact, we get things there that we don't get in other places. Sri Ramakrishna said that here, referring to himself, the experiences of this place go beyond what's written in the Vedas and Vedanta. So we get so much in this gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, all of these doctrines of Vijnana. Most of what we get in the Upanishads and the other scriptures, they'll take us to the roof. Sri Ramakrishna takes us back down again. And everything that we read about theoretically in the scriptures, we see that he experienced directly. We get his own direct, authoritative description of these spiritual states and these spiritual truths. So it's a really fantastic scripture. In many religious traditions, people will learn these sacred languages. In Christianity, they'll learn Aramaic and Hebrew to be able to read the gospel, to know the words of Christ. And I would encourage everyone who is really interested, learn a little Bengali. That to me, Bengali is also a sacred language. This is the language that Sri Ramakrishna used to be able to read the Gautamrita, read the gospel in the original. Is a very wonderful thing. I was inspired to learn Bengali only because of this gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So this is a very personal topic for me, and I am one of the very few, in fact I don't know another Western devotee who read the gospel after visiting Sri Ramakrishna's room in Dakshineshwar. Usually it'll be after many years of becoming a devotee in this country and reading the gospel, there'll be some interest to go there and see it. Well, I went there first. Just the circumstances were like that. Of course, I knew about Sri Ramakrishna, but I hadn't read the gospel. So when I read the gospel, the very first time, I knew exactly what it meant when he was facing north and sitting on the small cot and everything. I could picture it, everything, exactly the way it had taken place because I had been there. So these are two things. One, a little bit of Bengali to learn, especially those who know Hindi or any North Indian language, very easy to learn. Second thing is to visit Dakshineshwar. Of course, part of it takes place in Kashipur, the gospel, but really to me, the important period is Dakshineshwar, to be able to sit in Sri Ramakrishna's room, because this gospel is a meditation also. It has two portions. One is the descriptive portions, and Anne was a fantastic writer. The language that he uses is very high, Sanskritic, poetic Bengali. It's just gorgeous, beautiful. And then we have the very colloquial Bengali that Sri Ramakrishna spoke, his own words and everything. So it's really just a fantastic fantastic book. When I first started reading it, I couldn't put it down. I would read hours every night, and I would go through it very quickly. So I started with the small version, the abridged version, and then, of course, I got the big one. And I've been reading it every day. This is a regular habit. To me, this is one of the, if not the most, one of the most important spiritual practices, this reading this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Mahendranath Gupta, who we know as M, who was the recorder of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. The role that he played in the Vedantic movement, I think, is second only to Swami Vivekananda himself. Because without this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that he recorded, others of course recorded portions, but what he did without that, we would have lost so much. Swamiji, of course, carried this whole message to the West and everything, but this recording of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is one of the great boons to humankind that we can think of. So we owe M. Srima. We owe him a great debt of gratitude. I want to go through a little bit of how this Gospel was written, who M was, tell a little bit about the background and everything, because it's a very interesting story. And we get a better appreciation because the meeting between M and Sri Ramakrishna really was a life-changing meeting for him. And the relationship between the two of them is something very, very special. The study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is generally preceded by the chanting of a particular verse, this Tabagatamritam. I'll start with that, and that'll be the vehicle for this whole talk. Because why M chose this particular verse and how personal it was for him and what it meant to him in his own life is also another very interesting thing. So it starts out, Tabagatamritam Tatta Jivanam Kavibhiritam Kalmashapam Sharavanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuvigananti Bhuridajanaha. This is a verse from the Bhagavata Purana. It's a section called the Gopi Gita, and it's supposed to be the words of the gopis with reference to Sri Krishna. And we'll see that in M's mind, this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is the equivalent of the Bhagavata Purana, and Sri Ramakrishna is equivalent to Sri Krishna, right away. So he felt that it was perfectly appropriate to use that as the introduction. Tabagatamritam. This is so the title of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in Bengali is taken from the first words of this hymn, from this Gopi Gita. These nectar-like words of yours. Tabagatamritam, tapta jivanam. Those who are scorched in this world, this can bring life to them. Like someone who's in the desert dying of thirst. There's tapta jivanam. This will be the life-giving water for them. Kavibhiritam is praised by poets. Kalmashapaham. They can remove all stain, all sin. Sharavana mangalam. It's auspicious to hear. This is what I was saying. It's a type of spiritual practice in itself, to listen to the words of Sri Ramakrishna. No matter how much or how little we understand of it, it's a purifying thing, it's an elevating thing. So Shravana Mangalam, Shrimad. There's a certain beauty and majesty to this, a certain vastness, expansiveness. There's the liberality that we find. Those who will spread the words of Sri Ramakrishna, or Sri Krishna originally, throughout the world. These are the greatest benefactors of the world. There's no greater gift that anyone can give than this. So this is the verse that's always chanted before study of recitation of Gautamritam, and this was chosen by M himself. Now, we know this Gautamritam as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. This is not a translation that somebody else gave. When M wrote this, he actually wrote it in English first. That what happened was he would keep notes, and then he would go home and put them in his journal, and then later very cryptic notes. And then later he would meditate on it and he would write it out. And when he first went to publish this, he had no intention in the beginning. When he first went to publish it, he did it in English, and very biblical style English, and he called it the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Now this is also significant because he's also comparing this to the Bible, to the Gospel, the 4 Gospels that we have in the Christian Bible. So in his mind, this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is not only the same as the Bhagavata, but the same as the Christian Bible. And Sri Ramakrishna is equally holy as Sri Krishna or Jesus Christ. So this was his own title that he gave, this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So these were all very conscious things. This is not because he thought that what he was writing was so wonderful, but the words of Sri Ramakrishna, that these are something that were as holy as any of the sayings of the ancient rishis or anything like that. So when we read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we find that M did not give himself any prominent role. We know that he always referred to himself in the third person, that there were times when he used other names for himself, so he remained hidden there. But it doesn't negate the fact that his life was so intertwined with this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and with Sri Ramakrishna himself and the words of Sri Ramakrishna, that in fact we'll see that his first meeting with Sri Ramakrishna actually saved his life. So this Tapta Jivanam is a very literal thing with him, because he was really in such a terrible state that he was being scorched by the world, Tapta. And Sri Ramakrishna really literally gave him his life back. So this was a very, very personal thing for M, his meeting with Sri Ramakrishna and the debt of gratitude that he had towards Sri Ramakrishna. So we'll start with this Tapta Jivanam, that the words of Sri Ramakrishna have this power to bring life to scorched souls, those who were burnt by the misery and suffering of the world, that these have the power to refresh us. And if people ever come to me, we have so many devotees come that they're suffering from this and that, and they feel depressed and everything. I say, read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Read the words of Sri Ramakrishna. If anything can bring life to those who are suffering, this Tapta Jivanam, it's that. So I want to explain a little bit of the state of mind that M had when he met Sri Ramakrishna for the first time. M was born on July 14th, 1854, given the name Mahendranath Gupta, and he was very devoted. He was very sensitive boy, and throughout his life, very devoted to his parents, especially his mother. And his mother was a very pious woman, but she passed away in 1880. Now, this is just a year or so before M met Sri Ramakrishna for the first time. So this was a tremendous shock for him. So M was 26 years old at that time, and roughly a year, maybe 2 years before his very first visit to Sri Ramakrishna. Now, around the same time, M got attached to the Brahmo Samaj and was very devoted to Keshav Sin. and he practically worshipped him. This Keshav played a very significant role, you know, that in the Ramakrishna movement. So many of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna came through the Brahmo Samaj, and Keshav had tremendous love for Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna had tremendous love for him also, and Keshav would send people to him. And so this was also very important, and M ended up marrying a cousin of Keshav's. So his wife, Nikunja Devi, was a relative of Keshav, and M was a brilliant student in school, and we know he was so well versed in the English literature and philosophy and everything, in addition to both Eastern and Western studies, and he took up the profession of teaching. Now, M was very unhappy at home. It was a joint family. He missed his mother, and he didn't get along with his brothers. He was the only one who was the least bit really spiritual in the family. And by this time, he had already 4 children. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter at this point. And he decided that he could no longer live at home anymore. The life really became unbearable for him. And he made a plan that he would go to his sister's house in Baranagur. Now, he didn't tell anybody, but in the back of his mind was this idea that really life wasn't worth living anymore. And he had this idea that he would settle the family and everything, and he would take his own life. He would commit suicide. Yes. Yeah, he was so sensitive and so unhappy with his situation at this time. So anyhow, they made a secret plan that they would go to his sister's house in Baranagur. And he left earlier, he was supposed to meet her there. Then they hired a horse carriage, and so many different things happened that the carriage broke down. He went to a friend's house, and his friend didn't give him a very good welcome at all. He said, "No, you can't stay here." And he ended up going to his wife's sister's home, and this was the home of Ishan Kaviraj. Now, he was one of the doctors of Sri Ramakrishna. Now, you remember in the first meeting with Sri Ramakrishna, when Thakur asked him about his background and where are you staying and everything. I'm staying Baranagur, the house of Ishwar. As soon as he says this, Ishwar Kaviraj, he says, "Oh," and he says, "How is Keshav?" Because he knew the connection that way. So when M got there, he wasn't really a stranger to Sri Ramakrishna in his mind through this connection with Keshav. So anyhow, he made his way to his wife's sister's house, this Ishan Kaviraj, and apparently leaving her for the night at a friend's house. This is a little bit unclear. He was so exhausted and depressed and everything that he thought about taking his own life, but he didn't. For some reason, he didn't. Spent the night there. Then the next day, he and his nephew, Shidhu. Now, it's very interesting that Shidhu plays a very important role because he's the one who said, "Uncle, let me try to cheer you up a little bit. I know some beautiful garden areas and temples and things. We'll go and visit all of these places tomorrow." So they went to so many different places, and then at the end he said, "I know this beautiful new Kali temple. Rani Rashmani has built this. There's a beautiful garden. It was known for its gardens at that time. Let's go and visit that." So Shidhu is the one who took M to Sri Ramakrishna, and as far as we know, he never went back. Right? We never hear his name again. Right? Yeah. So this is the Leela. Everyone has their little role to play. So this is what happened then. He said, Shidhu said to him, he said, "Would you like to see a beautiful temple garden where a great Paramahamsa lives?" And this is exactly what appealed to M's mind, because he liked beautiful places. It's by the Ganga, and they have beautiful flower gardens and everything. And because of his spiritual nature, of course, he was very happy to meet a holy person, a Paramahamsa. So they went there. Now, the date was probably sometime in late February, the last weekend in February or the first weekend in March in 1882. This is the only entry in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that doesn't have the date on it, because after I met Sri Ramakrishna, then he realized that how important it was to keep track of everything. But the first time he and his mind was so confused, so we don't have an exact date for that. But this is the very first entry that we find in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And as I say, after that he was very particular about not just what the date was, but what the phase of the moon was, and every possible little detail that he would record in that Gospel. But we see that the impression that was made on M from the very second that he stepped into Sri Ramakrishna's room was something fantastic. And he got there just as the sun was setting, and all of the bells are being rung, and the conch shells are being blown, and for the worship evening arati in the temples. And by coincidence, my very first visit there, well, I got there exactly at that time also. I went to Bellarmad and took the little ferry boat across the Ganga there, and got there just as the sun was setting, and just as you could hear all of the bells being rung and everything. And it's just an unbelievable atmosphere. And walking into Sri Ramakrishna's room later, when I read about M, when he walked into his room, the feeling that he had, I could really understand it. Of course, when I went, it's only Sri Ramakrishna, and as we could imagine, he was there and actually met him. And all of the devotees were sitting there, and what did he say? It was like Shukadev was there reciting the Bhagavata to King Pariksit. That was his feeling. So again, that other connection with the Bhagavata Purana. So they went there, they went straight to Sri Ramakrishna's room, and they looked in from the outside veranda, and they saw Sri Ramakrishna seated on a small cot and speaking to a room full of devotees. And this is M's description of his first visit. They, now when he said they, he's referring to Sittu and himself. He always referred to himself in the third. He never said I. Because in fact, when I first read the Gospel, I was a little confused. Who's writing this? And somebody saying one devotee thought this. I said, how does he know who thought this? But then we see that it's really M, everything is M. So they arrived at the main gate and went straight to Sri Ramakrishna's room. And there they found him seated on a wooden couch facing the east. With a smile on his face, he was talking of God. The room was full of people, all seated on the floor, drinking in his words in deep silence. M stood there speechless and looked on. It was as if he were standing where all the holy places met, and as if Shukadeva himself were speaking the word of God, or as if Sri Chaitanya were singing the name and glories of the Lord in Puri. So this is the very first visit that M had to Sri Ramakrishna at the temple garden in Dakshineshwar with his nephew Sittu, who never came again as far as we know. Why is not very clear. He lived very close. Varanaguru is not far from Dakshineshwar. Now, Sri Ramakrishna, we know, had this ability to recognize those who had a very important role to play in his Leela. So as soon as he saw M, he recognized him. Not in this very specific way. Some of the others he knew right away. With M, it was a little bit different, but he knew that there was something special. In fact, M is one of the few that he kind of hedges a little bit. He says, I had a vision of Chaitanya Deva and with his followers there, and Balaram was there, and I think M also. So he's not very, but he knew that this M had a very important role to play, and we see this intimacy with which they talk, and even the scoldings that he gets at the very beginning. it's very interesting, as if he's known him for a long time when they meet, and just as we can hardly imagine the magnetic personality of Sri Ramakrishna if we could actually have met him and see him with his smile and everything, and have him talk to us in that way. So as soon as met Ramakrishna, spoke with him a little bit, all ideas of suicide or anything like that just flew out the window. So there's very literally, that very first meeting saved his life, if there was any real thought that he would commit suicide. Still, this problem about him living at home, whether he could live there or whether he should go and set up his own house, this goes throughout the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and actually throughout M's life. We see so many times Thakur telling him, can you go back home? Can you bow down before your father? Can you make up with the family? He wanted him to go home because he thought that he would be free from so many responsibilities in a joint family. He would have more time for a spiritual practice, and his mind would be in a better, calm state of mind if he didn't have this conflict with his family members. It's hard to say to what extent things got patched up. We know that he moved back, M did move back with his family on March 11th, 1882. This is around the 5th visit after Thakur requested him. But then he seems to have moved out later, and for part of the time he lived in that Morton school, and he had his own places. Sometimes he would even sleep in the open veranda. He did all sorts of things like that. But Sri Ramakrishna always tried to persuade him to have a good relationship with his father and the family members, and to move back. Yeah, later he taught for a while, and then he purchased a school. What happened was he was actually teaching in Vidyasagar school, and very often he would take some of the students that he saw were very spiritually minded. He would take them to see Sri Ramakrishna, and one year the marks weren't very high for his students, and Vidyasagar made a comment. Yeah, you're spending all your time with Sri Ramakrishna and taking the students there. That's why the marks aren't so good. So he immediately said, then I quit. So he had trouble finding a place, so he ended up starting his own school, this Morton institution. And he often lived in a solitary room on the roof of that building. And it's also because M really had the nature of a sannyasin and loved solitude, and had such a desire to renounce the world, to become a sannyasi. He practically begged Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna said no. That he wanted M to remain as an ideal, a new type of ideal, grihi sannyasi, someone who really is a sannyasi but lives within the household situation. So he never did, but he would do things like he would sleep in the open veranda of the Calcutta University Senate Hall. Many homeless people would sleep there, big open area. And he would just put out his blanket and just sleep in the midst of the homeless people, to feel that, as Swami said, have thou no home. This is aniketa. We read in Gita and everything, this idea of having no possessions, having no place to stay. He wanted to have that feeling, so he would do that. Now, another example of being scorched in the world, in 1884, one of M's sons died. And this was a terrible blow to him, but a worse blow to his wife, and his wife became practically mad. So not only did he suffer the loss of the child, but he had to constantly worry about his wife. And fortunately, Sri Ramakrishna arranged for Holy Mother to really be a companion, and Holy Mother really helped save the wife. His wife traveled with Holy Mother on pilgrimage to many different places. So Thakur really loved that family. He took such care of them. So we see that there are many references to this also, that his wife's state of mind and everything. And you'll notice that whenever there's talk about the child that died, they'll use a nickname for him. They'll say Mani or Manimohan, because it was too personal for him. Other times it's just M. I mean, he never used his full name. So this is another example of Tapta Jivanam, another example of how Sri Ramakrishna really helped to remove that terrible suffering of his wife also. Now the Shravana Mangalam, auspicious to hear these nectar-like words. This doesn't even come close to what these words meant to M. When Sri Ramakrishna said something to M, it was absolute. It was really the gospel to him. Not just auspicious, but this was the final word on everything. And he really looked upon these as kind of sacred mantras, and kept a whole list of sayings that Sri Ramakrishna had made. If it was anything directed to him, where he said directly, you do this, you do that, he called it an adesha. This was a command. So he kept a whole list of these different things. There were some things that M felt were so sacred, he called them mahavakyas. So he would keep a list of all of these things. There's a very beautiful scene in the beginning of the Gospel where M had, after spending some time with Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna said to him, or M said, will there be more songs tonight? And Sri Ramakrishna said, no, but I'm going to a devotee's house, Balaram Ghosh's house, go there, there'll be more singing there. M said, okay. And then he left. And then he went back again, and he said, oh, this is a rich man's house, maybe I won't be welcomed or anything. So Sri Ramakrishna said to him, just mention my name, Amar Naam Karo. It's a simple thing. What does it mean? Anyone will say that. Just mention my name and they'll let you in, they'll be happy and everything. And took this as meaning to repeat the name of Sri Ramakrishna. It is like a holy mantra. Just take my name. So this is how everything that Sri Ramakrishna said, Avaresho, this is a very common thing, that anybody leaves, you'll say, come again, Avaresho. But when Thakur said it to him, he said, I should come again. So the first chance I get, I'll come again. The very next day he went. So there's not just Shravana Mangalam, not just that the words were auspicious, but it was sacred. It was sacred. They were mahavakyas, they were adeshas, they were commands for him. So the words of Sri Ramakrishna were the whole life for M. Very often Sri Ramakrishna would send these young disciples to M. They would say, what can we learn from him? He's a householder. And Sri Ramakrishna would say, no, you'll only hear my words if you go there. And he used to say that. He said, what do I know? I don't know anything. But I live by a vast ocean, and I have a pitcher, and I can take the water from that ocean, and I can give it to people. That was his attitude. These were all the words of Sri Ramakrishna. Yeah, he said, I'm an insignificant person, but I live by the side of an ocean and keep with me a few pitchers of seawater. When a visitor comes, I entertain him with that. What else can I speak of but his words? Bhuvigarnantiye bhurirajana. They are the truly generous people, the great benefactors of the world who proclaim this message. Now, this was exactly M's attitude. When he first started recording the words of Sri Ramakrishna, he didn't have this idea that he would publish them or anything. At that time, it was sacred for him. And he wanted to make sure that it was recorded so that he would never forget it. But he knew that these had to be saved. They had to be saved for all of humankind. But it was something that he kept very private. It was a private thing for him. We read towards the end of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that Girish Ghosh said to him, we hear that you've written something. And he said, this is a private thing. And he said, well, we want to see it. Could we see it? He said, maybe after my death. So he had no idea when he first started doing it that these things would be for the welfare of so many people. Sri Ramakrishna knew it. Another interesting thing, there were others who at different times, would be taking notes and things. He said, what are you doing? One time, this Tarak, Mahapurush Maharaj, Swami Shivananda, he saw him writing something down. He said, it's not for you. He knew it was for him. And we may wonder why sometimes in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna would say to him, what did I say? Repeat back to me. And then M would do it, and then he would say yes. Every once in a while he would say no, and that's not exactly right. And he would change it a little bit. So he knew that this was part of this lila that was taking place. And M, for some reason, when he was a child, kept a journal. And he developed that habit. So that if he heard something, he would remember it and he could record it. So it was a lifelong practice with him, and he had this ability to recall the whole scene, that he would recall it later. Who was sitting in the room, where they were seated, what the time of day was, every possible detail there. Who was dancing, who was standing around. This was that tremendous power of recall that M had. Yeah, in the entire Gospel, we only find one reference to this writing of the Gospel. This was April 23rd, 1886. It's the very last entry in the Gospel during Sri Ramakrishna's lifetime. Part of the Gospel takes place after Thakur passed away, but Anugur, Mat period and everything. Girish said to him, I understand you were writing something about the Master. Is it true? Who told you about that? Girish, I heard about it. Will you give it to me? No, I won't part with it unless I feel it is right to do so. I am writing it for myself, not for others. Girish, what do you mean? You may get it when I die. Now, the actual writing of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, of course, what we know as the Gospel is a translation that was done many years later by Swami Nikhilananda. The original version that was written in English was never the complete thing, and it was written in a very biblical style, because he wanted it to be biblical. He thought of it as the Bible with these and thous and everything. You can find that, and it's called the condensed Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. It's still available. It's interesting, but not so interesting. Because the actual words that Sri Ramakrishna spoke in Bengali, of course, seemed much more important to everyone. Anyhow, what happened was that M would put all of his notes into his journal, and it was in a very cryptic form, so that even if he had given that to Girish wouldn't have been able to get too much out of it. There's some things that can be deciphered. There's Swami Prabhahanandaji, who is now one of the vice presidents of the order. He was able to see all of the journals. The family members, M's family members, guarded these very tightly. They didn't want people to see it, and they didn't want to publish it or anything, but he got permission, so he could make something out of it. But a lot of it is very cryptic, almost like the sutras that we have. That if you don't know what the real reference is, we have to rely on the commentators. M explained his method. He said, I would carry the nectar-like words of Thakur in my memory and would record them briefly in the diary on returning home. So it's not like he was sitting in the room with pen and paper when he was there. The book written out from these notes appeared much later. On every scene I had meditated 1,000 times. See, this was his meditation. When he would meditate, he would think of just sitting in front of Sri Ramakrishna and listening to his words. That was his meditation. Therefore, I could relive those moments by Thakur's grace. When I did not feel satisfied with my descriptions, I would plunge myself into meditation on Thakur. Then the correct image would rise before my mind's eye in a bright, real, living form. So it's really the accuracy and the authenticity of the words that we have of Sri Ramakrishna is something fantastic. It's not just M's great memory. There was some grace, some mystical process taking place where he would really see these things. They would come right back to him that way. There's a very beautiful book called Otitya Sriti, in English, Story of an Epic. It's about the life of Swami Virajananda. Swami Virajananda was one of M's students. Many of his students became monks later. There was a whole group of them, and they used to go to Ramchandra Datta's place. Ram was Swamiji's relative, some type of uncle or cousin, uncle, something. We know when Thakur passed away that Ram kind of wanted his Kakragachi place to be the kind of the headquarters, and the ashes, the relics should be kept there, and how Swamiji and the others, they secretly kept some aside. So there was kind of, I don't want to say there were two separate organizations, but Ram kind of looked upon himself as kind of the keeper of the faith after that. And then the other poor boys were in Baranaguamat without a penny or anything. So he actually had kind of disciples, and people would go to him, and he would talk about Sri Ramakrishna, and he had his own understanding of things. He used to criticize these young boys, well, why are you spending hours in meditation and everything? It just shows your lack of faith. Sri Ramakrishna, if you realize he was an avatar, then you're free. You had the touch of the avatar. So that was his attitude. Their attitude was different. Yeah, we had his grace, of course, but we want to be established in that. So many of these boys, this Kali Krishna who became Swami Virajananda, many of them went to Ramchandra's place. So M was their professor, their teacher, but a friend also. He liked them very much, and they had a nice relationship. So one day M said to him, to these boys, he said, yes, Rama is a wonderful devotee, you'll learn so much about Sri Ramakrishna there, but if you really want to know who Sri Ramakrishna was, you go to Baranagar and meet his monastic disciples, Swamiji and Maharaj, all of them. So this is the account that we have by this Kali Krishna, who became Swami Virajananda. He was the first monastic member of the Ramakrishna order who wasn't a direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. He had his mantra diksha from Holy Mother and sannyas and diksha from Swamiji. There was one Kogen. He became Swami Vimalananda, and they were all good friends. There were several of them: Bodhananda, Shuddhananda, Atmananda, Prakashananda, all of them M students. So this was actually the account given by Kogen. He said he noticed that when everyone else went to lunch, that M was nowhere to be found. So they followed him one day, and he saw that he went up to the roof, and that he would sit there with paper and pen by his side and go into deep meditation, and then he would open his eyes and would write something down. So they became curious, and they had that relationship with him that they could approach him and ask him about that. So that's when he explained to them that he was writing this. He was picturing all of the scenes and everything. When everyone else was having lunch, he would go up there and go into that state of meditation. And this is how, even when he was in the midst of doing his teaching as a school teacher, that he would be working on this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. February 5th 1889, Swamiji and a few brother disciples went to Atpur. Now Atpur is the birthplace of Babu Ramaraj, Swami Premananda. This is where they all went on Christmas Eve, and when they had that Dhuni fire and they took the monastic vows and took all of their names and everything. So this was a later trip. Holy Mother was also there, and M was also there. And this was the first time that M read out to them some of the writings from his diary notes, what was later to become the Gautamritam. Perhaps he was inspired somehow. Before this, it was pretty much just a private thing. And there were some other attempts also, some other biographies. Ramchandra also wrote something. So maybe M felt that these things weren't exactly as authentic as they should be. Maybe that was also an incentive. Anyhow, Swamiji was there, and he listened to this. He listened very quietly without saying anything. And later he wrote to M. We're supposed to stop at 8:30, huh? What time? No, 9. Okay. 9. So later he wrote to M. Thanks 1,000 times, Master. You have hit Ramakrishna, the Ramakrishna they used to call Ramakrishna, on the right point. Few, alas, few understand him. Yours, Narendra. P.S. My heart leaps in joy. Probably this is the English translation, I don't know. He probably wrote in Bengali, huh? My heart leaps in joy, and it is a wonder that I do not go mad when I find anybody thoroughly launched into the midst of the doctrine which is to shower peace on earth hereafter. So this was Swamiji's reaction when he first heard this, some little bits of M's writing. Then Holy Mother later wrote to M, Baba Jiva, very beautifully, my dear child, we can say. Whatever you've heard from him, meaning Sri Ramakrishna, is nothing but the truth. You need not feel any hesitation about it. That means about publishing these things. At one time, it was he who placed those words in your custody. And it is he who is now bringing them to the light of day according to the needs of the times. Know it for certain that unless those words are brought out, mankind will not have its consciousness awakened. See, the trust that she put in them and the importance that she gave to all of this. All the words of his that you have with you, every one of them is true. One day when you read them out to me, I felt as if it was he who was speaking. So M decided that he would publish these things. And there was a periodical that was started by Swamiji called the Brahmavadan. And M started writing these in the forms of articles, and as I said before, in English. And the first one was October 15th, 1897, and it was called Leaves from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. This is the title that M gave to it. And everyone was so impressed, they thought it was so wonderful, but they all said, yes, but it would be nice in Bengali that we should hear it exactly as Sri Ramakrishna said it, if we had it in his words. So then M was inspired, and he first started writing in Bengali 1898, and he used the title Lilamrita the first time. Maybe because of this Tabagatamrita verse, he quickly changed to Katamrita, but in the beginning, the nectar of this divine play, Lilamrita, and he wrote it actually in 5 different volumes. The first 4 were written between the years of 1902 and 1910. And each one goes through the whole period of Sri Ramakrishna's life that M was with him. It's not like the first volume was the first year they were together, second was the second year. For some reason, M decided to pick and choose some things. We don't know whether he put the things that he thought were most important in the first volume, and then he thought other things in the second. one thing we see that the fourth volume contains a lot of what's called Guhyakatha. There's Guhyakatha, the secret things. That sometimes Sri Ramakrishna would say, look, there's no one else around. You're all my very own people. I'll tell you something very secret. So maybe at the beginning didn't want to publish those things. Otherwise, it's not very clear because it, as I say, it covers the same time period. So what we have in the English version, it was all put together. So it's from beginning to end, it's chronological. And after this Kathamrita became public domain, it started being published in Bengali that way also. You can still get it in the 5 separate volumes, but now we have this Akhanda. The whole thing is all together. And the 5th one was done in 1932, 22 years later, the last volume. And this only treats of the final year of Sri Ramakrishna's life in Champakor and Kashipur, and a little bit of afterwards the Paranava. This was published just after the passing away of him. And to the very end of his life, he was checking proofs and galleys and things like that. So why we have this big gap? We know that it was very painful for him to write about the Kashipur period of Thakur's life because there was so much suffering there. Even in this, the great master, Leela Prasanga, even Swami Sharananda, he didn't write very much about that period. And I mentioned the Swami Prabhanandaji, he wrote something called his Antya Leela about this last year of his life. Most of the things that M wrote were descriptions of Thakur's medical condition that he had, because his job was to report to the doctor, Dr. Sharkar or others. So he would keep track of how much blood he lost. He had a lot of bleeding from the sore in his throat and things like that. But and for long periods, Sri Ramakrishna couldn't speak, so there wouldn't have been that much that he could write. But mostly it was too painful for all of them, that episode. So we don't get that till the very end of his life, that the Kashipur and Champakor period of his life. Now, if we want to go to the main teachings, and of course it's a very big issue, but I'll just try to go through in a very cursory manner these main teachings, because we find that in M's first couple of visits we get everything. We get everything. The rest of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is really kind of an extrapolation on these teachings. We'll find that M, he asks a series of beautiful questions, and the answers cover all of the different, the 4 yogas, and almost everything that we'll get. Not that the rest of it isn't equally valuable. Of course it is, but it's just amazing how important that first section is. And we can even see just the list of questions that we have and the different answers. So anyhow, on M's second visit, he asked Ramakrishna 4 questions. The first visit, of course, Thakur asked him a lot of questions. Are you married? Yes, I'm married. Ah, Ramlal, he's married. Do you have any children? Yes, children. Ah, and he has children. So we have that whole thing. And then all of course, M's big talk about we should tell these people not to worship these idols and everything, and the different scoldings that he gets. But with great humility, in the second visit, he asked these 4 very, very important questions, and this really gives us the essence of all of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. This blending of the 4 yogas, and really there's such a similarity between the Bhagavad Gita and this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the way that the different yogas are harmonized, the different spiritual paths that way. So we find this blending of the 4 yogas, and This is why, this is a very common comparison. Swami Paramashananda was a disciple of Holy Mother, very, very highly revered Swami of our order. He used to say that the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna was the Bengali translation of the Gita. Tongue-in-cheek, you would say, but meaning that if you want a Bengali version that will give all of the same teaching, that it will be this Gautama. So, the first question was, how, sir, may we fix our minds on God? See, in Gita, we have this, if you approach a holy person, what do you have to do? Pariprashna. You have to have a good question to ask. Pratipata. You have to have humility. Bow down. Seva. You have to serve. So this prashna. This, how, sir, may we fix our minds on God? Number one. So that'll be with our Raja Yoga and our meditation and everything. Number two. How ought we to live in the world? So, Karma Yoga. How do we live in the world? Then, is it possible to see God? So now we get to very practical things. And four, under what conditions does one see God? Right, so think how beautiful these questions are. So when Thakur gives his answers, we find that the first one, the essence of Raja Yoga, which is meditation, he talked about solitude. Two of the great teachings of Sri Ramakrishna are holy company and solitude. He gives a very special emphasis to these two. Very often, the first thing he'll say is, keep holy company, and if you can't, then go into solitude. Other times, he'll say both together. Then he'll add other things, of course, prayer, meditation, and these things, but holy company, we get the direct touch. And for Sri Ramakrishna, holy company meant him. Now, it doesn't mean that he had any ego. We know he had no ego whatsoever, but he knew that for him and others, that how beneficial it was for them to have his company that way. When we go through the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we see that he didn't give too much attention to pilgrimage. And it's curious, why not? Everyone that we all know that's very inspiring to go to these places. Because he knew that he wouldn't be around forever. Better for them while he was alive to have his company. Of course he didn't want to say it like that, but he never really encouraged them to go too much on pilgrimage that way. So there's holy company and meditation and solitude. Very Boni is a very wonderful idea. Go into a quiet place in the woods, Boni. Or if you can't do that, find a little corner of your house, Koni. But really everything is meditate deep within the heart, Moni. So this was an answer to that first question. Then, Karma Yoga. He gives all of these beautiful illustrations. Probably the most important illustration, and the one that he repeats more often, is live in the world like the maidservant in the rich man's home. In those days, it was common, probably still, it was common for some of these poor village women to take up a job with a wealthy person to be like a nanny, to help raise the kids and to feed them and everything, and do some housework. The wife of this wealthy man, she would not have to bother with all of those things. She'd have time for social teas and whatever. But other women would do it, and we have it in this country also. Sometimes, if you go to a park, you'll see all of the women with the babies in the strollers, and all the women speaking in Spanish to each other. Right? Yeah.
They're sitting and just talking.
Yeah, they'll be sitting and talking, and then the kids, they'll all be from these wealthy American homes. Yeah. And what will they talk about? Oh, you should have seen what my little boy did, how cute he was and everything, and I spent all day, cleaning the kitchen this morning and everything, and my kitchen and my house and then my child and all of that. But They know that it's not their child, they know that it's not their house, it's not their kitchen, none of that.
Right.
But they love the child, and they have regard for the house, and they look after everything, and they want to keep it sparkling clean. They do all of that, even though they know deep down it doesn't belong to them. This is half of the story. The other half is they know that they have their own house in the village, they have their own husband, and they have their own children, and everything there. That's their real house. So we live in the world like that, where we treat everyone as if they belong to us, as if we really own this house, as if these are really our very own near and dear ones and everything. We love them, of course, but we know that we have that our own abode, that transcendent abode with God. That's our real home. That the Divine Mother is our real mother, that way. So this was one of his great teachings, and something that is so practical and helpful. It allows us to love without being attached, and without that feeling of possessiveness. This is the beauty of it. So this was his answer to that second question, how ought we to live in the world? And then, is it possible to see God? Then he goes right to this idea of discrimination. So we get Jnana Yoga right after that. He said discrimination between the real and the unreal. Now, Thakur, he had a very clear and sharp understanding. He had a brilliant mind. I think Swami Vivekananda's mind was about as brilliant as we can imagine, but nothing like Thakur's mind. Thakur had such clarity of vision. So when he spoke about discrimination, he meant it on all different levels. This between the real and the unreal. For him, that meant between the eternal and the transitory. He never stressed this idea that this world is unreal, like a dream. He didn't like that idea, actually. But he said it's floating by, transitory. There's nothing to hold on to, nothing substantial in it that way. But he stressed this other idea of discrimination, that always try to think, will this take you closer to God, or will this get you entangled in the world? This is also a type of viveka. This is that what we read in the Katha Upanishad, between Shreyas and Preyas. That we have to discriminate between what's pleasant and enjoyable and what's really good for us. So he gives these teachings about discrimination between the real and the unreal, and then he goes to Bhakti Yoga. So we get all four yogas. He talks about this intense yearning for the vision of God. This, from a practical point of view, is the final word for Sri Ramakrishna. Bakulata, we have this word, this term, this Bengali term, it's a Sanskrit word, that Sri Ramakrishna uses over and over again. This for him is the single most important factor in taking us to that ultimate experience of God realization. And when if anyone asks him, what's the value in holy company? He'll say, it increases longing for God. Why do we do our meditation? It increases longing for God. Everything is secondary to that. And this longing for God is the ultimate and final cause for God realization. And when we get that, he says that it's like the pink sky in the early morning. We know that the sun will rise. It's automatic. There's no question about it. So he talks about this Bhakti Yoga and this intense yearning for the vision of God. Actually, it's more than yearning, it's restlessness. It's a type of agony of heart. The real meaning of Vyakulata is anguish and agony, where it becomes unbearable. And so unbearable that one is ready to take one's life. This is, of course, what Sri Ramakrishna stated. He himself reached. Everything that he spoke about was from direct experience. When he couldn't have the vision of the Divine Mother, then he had that intense anguish of heart, that unless he could have that vision, life wasn't worth living. So he was ready to take his life, and of course he had that vision. at that time. Now I want to we have a little bit of time to talk about this reading of this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna as a spiritual practice, because for me this becomes the greatest aid in meditation also. Not just in our understanding of these very subtle and difficult spiritual concepts, but in filling the mind with that mood. Meditation is more about mood than anything else. Bhava, we have to get into a certain mood. Meditation is about feeling. That's why Thakur always talks about the heart center, that we meditate within the heart center. So I found that when I first read this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, that it has the power to capture us somehow, and that reading it is a spiritual practice in itself. Every bit as valuable as our meditation, japa prayer, anything else. In fact, far more valuable, because our meditation, if yours is anything like mine, it doesn't go that deep. Mind wanders, right? Sometimes we may fall asleep even, but reading this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we can find ourselves there. We find ourselves sitting with Sri Ramakrishna in his room. This is the beauty of it. It's not just that he recorded his words. There's a reason why he wrote every little detail. Who was sitting where, what other people were in the room, what time of day it is. There's a reason for all of that. So, I found that when I started reading this, that I just, it became kind of an addiction for me. You know, Sri Ramakrishna used that illustration with an M, that when M came back the very next day, he said, you know, there was a man who gave a little bowl of opium to a peacock. And he came back every day at exactly the same time for another dose. So it was the same thing every night. I made it a habit. I was a college student in graduate school at that time, and I read, and I was learning Bengali so that I could read the Gospel in Bengali, and I would read the English and Bengali next to each other. And yeah,
Wonderful.
yes, it was wonderful. And there was a statement that I read. Thakur said, "Shondha balai shab kaj chare Ishurer shoron kor." That when the sun goes down, the sunset, set aside all of your work and think of God. So I made it a practice that I would finish all of my schoolwork and everything before sunset. And then that night I would spend just in meditation and reading the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So I would read for about an hour at least every night. And I found this very magical thing would happen. This is in a very dingy, tiny apartment in West Philadelphia, in a very bad neighborhood and everything. But when I would close my eyes to sit for meditation, the room would be transformed into Thakur's room. And I would just feel that I was sitting there with him. And this is the way I would meditate that way.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So this is the power that this book has. If we spend enough time with it, and we shouldn't feel it's not a book that we ever finish. That if we can make this part of our spiritual practice, read some. Doesn't have to be an hour, of course, but a little bit every day. And I've been doing it for how many years? 47 years, something like that. Long time.
Every day you read?
Every day. Of course. I mean, if something happens, then, you know, I'm in the hospital or something. But yeah.
47 years.
Yeah, in general, yeah. Every day I read it at night before I go to sleep. But sometimes in the morning also, it's a very nice way to practice meditation. The Lila Dhyana, that we sit for meditation. Not only are we sitting in his room, but we can picture whatever took place that day. We can read it. So some people will do it that way. So, This book, the scripture, Gospel of Ramakrishna, should be read as a meditation. When we read it, we should really try to picture it, what's happening. We should imprint that on our minds, on our hearts. And this is why I say the trip to Thakur's room is very important. This is something that M recommended very, very strongly to anyone who came to him. He would say, have you been to Dakshineshwar? And he said, go there. Don't go as a tourist. You go, and each and every place you see, remember what took place there. Picture what took place. You go to the Beltree, picture Thakur doing his tantric sadhana there, go to Panchavati, go into his room, you'll see where that big container of Ganges water is, that Thakur sat there, he did Shodashi Puja, sitting right there. Imagine each and everything so that when you sit for meditation you can bring it back, you can recall it. I read that many years later, but I was doing it without realizing it. I was doing that same thing. So this is what M would tell everyone. Visit the room, take special note of where everything is, where all the pictures are, everything. So you sit for meditation, you can recreate all of that. So this Dakshineshwar was such a holy place for him. One of my very favorite scenes from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. This took place December 9th, 1883, and was walking with Sri Ramakrishna near the Panchavati. And of course, this is where Thakur did so much of his spiritual practice and planted the trees himself. And then Sri Ramakrishna was talking about some of his spiritual experiences. Then we read in the Gospel, M remained silent with wonder. He plucked one or two leaves from a branch in the Panchavati and put them in his pocket. Master, see here, that branch has been broken. I used to sit under it. M, I took a young twig from that tree. I have it at home. Master, why? M, I feel very happy when I look at it. After all this is over, this place will be considered very holy. Yeah. So, the two things. These are companion things. Reading the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and going to his room, sitting in his room in Dakshineshwar and seeing everything there. And of course, today it is a great place of pilgrimage. It's recognized throughout the world. And really what took place in those few years between 1882 and 1885, when Sri Ramakrishna had to move to Kashipur. The years that are recorded, of course he was there much longer than that, but the years that are recorded by him are something very, very sacred. And as I say, we owe this tremendous debt of gratitude to him for the great gift that he's given to all of us. So this is the introduction to our weekend program. Tomorrow I'm going to talk more about one of the great themes of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, this idea of what happens in his understanding of what happens coming down from that state. We talk so much about climbing to the roof and coming back down that vijnana state in terms of the wonderful experience that he had when he heard the voice of the Divine Mother saying, remain in Bhavamukha. Remain in that state where you can live in the world, but you look in one direction, you see the infinite absolute, you look in the other direction, you see everything filled with God. So that'll be what we'll discuss tomorrow, is remain in Bhavamukha. Any questions? It's late a little bit, but if anybody has a quick question. Okay, then is that Prasad?